The town of Pine Ridge laughed when Beatrice hauled half a ton of rotting fruit up the mountain. They called her a lunatic, whispering behind ledgers and storefronts. But when the November avalanche swallowed the only tracks out of the valley, their laughter froze. Starvation doesn't negotiate with pride. The heatwave of late August in 1898 was the kind that baked the soil into cracked porcelain and drove the townsfolk of Pine Ridge into the shaded, damp corners of their porches. It was on the hottest Tuesday of the month that Beatrice Gallagher made the purchase that would cement her reputation as the town's most tragic eccentric. Beatrice was 47, a widow of 10 years, living in a sprawling, drafty cabin on the elevated outskirts of town. She was known for keeping to herself, tending to a modest garden, and occasionally mending clothes for the lumberjacks who passed through. But she was not known for extravagance. That changed when Arthur Pendleton's wagon rattled up the mountain path, groaning under a tarp-covered load that attracted a dark, swirling cloud of bluebottle flies. Arthur, the owner of the struggling hawthorn orchards, situated 20 miles down in the valley, looked like a man who had not slept in weeks. His crop had ripened too fast in the unrelenting sun, and the canning factory in the city had abruptly cancelled his contract due to a financial dispute. He was left with hundreds of pounds of peaches, apricots, plums, and apples that were days away from turning into a fermented, rotting puddle. "I'll give it all to you for $12, B," Arthur pleaded, wiping sweat and grime from his forehead with a stained handkerchief. "It's 500 pounds, mostly good, some bruised. I just need enough to pay the bank the interest this month, or I lose the land." Beatrice stood on her porch, her arms crossed over her faded linen apron. The smell was overpowering, a thick, cloying sweetness of overripe sugar and impending decay. 500 pounds of fruit was a logistical nightmare for one woman. It would require round-the-clock labor to salvage. $12 is nearly my winter coal fund, Arthur," she said, her voice steady, eyes narrowing at the bruised bounty. "Please. It'll spoil in 3 days. You can make preserves, sell them back to Clara's general store," he bargained, his voice cracking. Beatrice didn't care for Clara Higgins, the town gossip and proprietor of the only supply store in Pine Ridge, but she felt a sudden, inexplicable tightening in her chest. A quiet voice, perhaps born of her grandmother's frontier survivalism, whispered that food, in any form, was life. $10, Beatrice said, "and you help me carry the crates onto the wraparound porch." By nightfall, Arthur was gone, leaving Beatrice surrounded by 50 wooden crates. The sheer volume of it was terrifying. Plums the size of small fists, their purple skins splitting, peaches weeping golden syrup, tart green apples, and heavy, fragrant apricots. The next morning, word had already spread. Thomas, Beatrice's younger brother and the town's deputy sheriff, rode up to her cabin. He took one look at the porch and pinched the bridge of his nose. "B, what in God's name have you done?" Thomas asked, swatting a wasp away from his face. "Clara is laughing her head off down at the mercantile. She says you've bought a graveyard for fruit flies." "Clara's mind is as narrow as her profit margins," Beatrice replied without looking up. She was already elbow-deep in a basin of water, aggressively scrubbing peaches before plunging them into a boiling pot to blanch the skins. "You can't eat all this," Thomas argued, stepping over a puddle of sticky water. "And it's too hot to can. You don't even have enough glass jars for 1/10 of this. It's going to rot, B. You threw away your coal money for garbage." "I am not canning it, Thomas. I am drying it," she said, finally pausing to wipe her brow with the back of a damp wrist. "All of it." What followed was a month of grueling, relentless labor that isolated Beatrice entirely. While the town prepared for the autumn festival, Beatrice became a prisoner to the fruit. She slept in 2-hour intervals. Her hands became permanently stained a dark, bruised purple, the acid of the plums and apples eating into the cracks of her skin until her fingers bled. She transformed her home into a massive dehydration facility. She built slatted wooden racks out of old fence posts and chicken wire, stacking them high in the sunniest patches of her yard. When the autumn rains briefly threatened, she hauled the racks inside, stringing the fruit up on twine across her living room, kitchen, and bedroom. She kept her cast-iron wood stove burning day and night to suck the moisture from the air, turning her cabin into a stifling, sweet-smelling sauna. Mayor Silas Thornton, a man whose arrogance was matched only by his tailored suits, rode past her property one afternoon. Seeing Beatrice hauling a massive tray of shriveled, leather-like apricots, he tipped his hat with a mocking smile. "Preparing for the apocalypse, Mrs. Gallagher?" Silas called out. "Or just hoping to build a house out of fruit leather? The Silvercrest Express runs every week with fresh supplies. We aren't pioneers anymore. There's no need to live like a savage." Beatrice didn't answer him. She just flipped a row of drying apple rings, her expression hardened into a mask of pure grit. She didn't know why she was doing it anymore. The initial desire to help Arthur had morphed into a strange, consuming obsession. By late September, the house no longer smelled of rot. It smelled of concentrated summer. The 500 pounds of heavy, wet fruit had been painstakingly reduced to roughly 80 pounds of dense, calorie-rich dried goods. She packed the hardened, chewy pieces into tightly woven burlap sacks and large clay crocks, sealing them with wax and storing them in her dry cellar. When it was done, she collapsed into a chair on her porch, her body aching, her winter coal fund depleted. Down in the valley, the town of Pine Ridge bustled with the confidence of modern convenience. They had the train, they had Clara's store, they had Silas's promises. Beatrice sat alone in the crisp autumn air, exhausted, wondering if the town was right. Perhaps she truly was mad. The false security of October was a beautiful, golden lie. The leaves turned brilliant shades of amber and crimson, and the people of Pine Ridge grew complacent. Mayor Silas Thornton had convinced the town council to delay the bulk order of winter flour, salted meats, and grain, arguing that commodity prices in the city would drop by mid-November. Why pay a premium now when the Silvercrest Express can bring it directly to our depot for pennies on the dollar next month? Silas had boomed during a town hall meeting. It was sound economic logic, provided the world operated on a ledger. But nature did not read balance sheets. The shift happened on the evening of November 4th. The temperature plummeted 30 degrees in a matter of hours. The wind howled through the canyon, carrying a metallic, bitter scent that the old-timers recognized with deep unease. Down at the telegraph office, a young operator named Samuel was brewing a pot of chicory coffee when the machine sprang to life. The clicking was erratic, rushed. Samuel grabbed his notepad, his pencil flying across the page as he transcribed the Morse code. Severe weather advisory. Blizzard conditions. Avalanche warning, Dead Man's Pass. Silvercrest delayed. Then the wire went completely dead. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the small office. By midnight, the snow began to fall. It didn't drift down in gentle flakes. It drove sideways in sheets of solid, blinding white. It snowed for 3 days without a single pause. Pine Ridge was buried under 6 feet of snow, and the temperature hovered near zero. When the storm finally broke on the 4th day, the town woke to a devastating reality. Thomas Gallagher and a crew of lumberjacks strapped on snowshoes and trekked toward Dead Man's Pass, the narrow canyon that served as the only railway entrance to the valley. They returned at dusk, their faces pale and drawn. Thomas marched straight into Clara's general store, where a crowd of anxious townsfolk had already gathered, demanding answers. Mayor Silas was standing by the counter, attempting to project authority. "The tracks are gone," Thomas announced, his voice carrying over the murmurs. The room fell dead silent. The whole side of the mountain gave way. There's a wall of snow, ice, and boulders 40 feet high blocking the pass. The trestle bridge is snapped in two. The Silver Crest isn't coming. Not this week, not next month. We won't see a train until the spring thaw. Panic, cold and sharp, ignited in the room. Clara Higgins immediately stepped in front of her shelves. "Rations!" she shrieked. "I'm tripling the prices. I only have enough canned goods for a few weeks." "You can't do that," shouted a mill worker, stepping forward. Silas raised his hands. "Calm down. Let's not lose our heads. We have the town's emergency grain silo. We have enough wheat and barley to keep everyone fed. We'll organize a rationing committee." The mention of the town silo quelled the immediate riot. The silo, a massive wooden structure near the edge of the river, was supposed to hold the emergency surplus. Silas, Thomas, and several men trudged through the deep snow to unlock it, carrying lanterns into the freezing dark. As Thomas threw open the heavy wooden doors, a foul, damp odor rolled out, hitting them like a physical blow. It was the smell of mildew and rot. Silas stood frozen, his lantern illuminating a nightmare. The roof of the silo, which Silas was supposed to have had repaired in the summer, had a massive structural leak. The autumn rains had poured in unnoticed. The bottom half of the grain was a black, swelling mass of mold. The top half had become a breeding ground for rats, who were now scurrying frantically away from the light. "Silas," Thomas whispered, horrified. "You told the council you fixed the roof. You took the funds for the lumber." Silas stammered, stepping back. I meant to. The contractor from the city delayed. I thought we had time." The truth was a death sentence. Pine Ridge, a town of over 200 people, was cut off from the world, trapped in a frozen valley with virtually no food. By the second week of December, the desperation had taken hold. Clara's store had been emptied, her wealth in paper money entirely useless. Men scoured the woods for game, but the wildlife had either fled the brutal freeze or was buried deep. Boiled leather and pine needle tea became common meals. The children were the first to show the signs of extreme malnourishment. Lethargy, pale skin, and the early, terrifying symptoms of scurvy, bleeding gums and bruised limbs. The town's meager supply of root vegetables was gone. Up on the ridge, Beatrice Gallagher sat in her rocking chair, a heavy wool blanket draped across her shoulders. She had heard the news from Thomas, who had trudged up the mountain, looking gaunt and defeated. "We're going to starve, Bea," Thomas had confessed, weeping by her wood stove. "Silas doomed us all. The children down in the valley. Clara's youngest is too weak to walk." Beatrice stood up. She walked over to the trap door leading to her cellar and heaved it open. She climbed down the wooden ladder into the freezing dark, striking a match to light a lantern. There, lining the walls were the burlap sacks and clay crocks, 80 pounds of concentrated, nutrient-dense, vitamin-rich fruit. It was not enough to feed 200 people for a winter on its own, but it was enough to keep them alive. It was sugar, calories, and most importantly, the life-saving vitamin C that the town desperately lacked. Beatrice picked up a heavy sack of dried plums and apples, the very fruit the town had mocked her for hauling up the mountain. She climbed back up, dropping the sack at Thomas's feet. "Fetch your sled, Thomas," Beatrice said, her voice hard as steel. "We have a delivery to make to Mayor Thornton." The descent from the ridge was a perilous undertaking. The snow was packed tight, a glittering icy crust over deep drifts that threatened to swallow Thomas and Beatrice whole. They lashed the heavy burlap sacks of dried fruit to a wooden toboggan, their breaths pluming in the freezing air like locomotive steam. Beatrice wore 3 layers of wool, her late husband's heavy hunting coat draped over it all, yet the cold still gnawed at her bones. It was a silent, agonizing trek down the mountain, the only sound the rhythmic, scraping hiss of the sled runners against the ice. When they finally reached the valley floor, Pine Ridge resembled a graveyard. The chimneys, usually billowing thick grey wood smoke, offered only thin, anemic wisps. The people were burning their furniture to stay warm. They hauled the sled directly to the town hall, a sturdy stone building where Silas Thornton had centralized the remaining, pitiful rations. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, fear, and sickness. Dozens of townsfolk were huddled on the floorboards, wrapped in whatever blankets they had left. In the corner, a group of women, including Clara Higgins, were tending to the children. Clara looked up as the heavy oak doors swung open, her face gaunt, her eyes hollowed out by terror. Her youngest son, a boy of 7, lay lethargic in her lap, his gums bleeding, his skin marred by the dark, spreading bruises of severe scurvy. Silas emerged from his makeshift office, looking distinctly healthier than the rest of his constituents. He wore a thick, fur-lined coat, his cheeks still retaining a hint of color. "Thomas," Silas said, his eyes darting to the loaded sled. "What is this? Did you find a cache?" "It's not mine," Thomas said, his voice raspy from the cold. He stepped aside, revealing his sister. "It's Beatrice's." Silas forced a patronizing smile, though his eyes gleamed with desperate greed. "Mrs. Gallagher, I must commend your frontier spirit. We will add this to the town's communal stores immediately. I will have my clerks inventory the sacks." He reached out to grab the nearest burlap bag. Beatrice stepped forward, bringing the heavy heel of her leather boot down squarely on the wooden runner of the sled, stopping Silas in his tracks. "You will not touch a single dried apple, Silas Thornton," Beatrice said, her voice cutting through the silent room like a sharpened axe. The huddled townsfolk shifted, drawing their blankets tighter, watching the confrontation with wide, sunken eyes. "Beatrice, be reasonable," Silas hissed, lowering his voice to keep the desperation from leaking out. "I am the mayor. I have the authority to commandeer private supplies in a state of emergency for the equitable distribution of the populace." "Equitable distribution?" Beatrice scoffed, stepping closer to him. She could smell the faint, unmistakable scent of salted pork and pipe tobacco on his breath. "Like the equitable distribution of the lumber meant for the grain silo? The lumber that somehow paid for your new imported mahogany desk?" A collective gasp rippled through the hall. Silas's face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. "That is slander. I am trying to save this town." "You have doomed this town to fill your own pockets," Beatrice shot back, her gaze sweeping over the starving crowd. "My brother is the deputy sheriff, and as of this moment, he is the only law I recognize. I am not turning this food over to a man who let the emergency rations rot. I will distribute it myself." Silas turned to Thomas, expecting backup, but Thomas merely rested his hand on the handle of his revolver, his expression unreadable. Silas backed away, muttering curses under his breath, and retreated into his office, slamming the door. Beatrice wasted no time. She ordered Thomas to build up the fire in the hall's massive stone hearth and fill 3 iron cauldrons with snow to melt into water. She opened the first clay crock, breaking the wax seal. The pungent, sweet aroma of concentrated summer filled the stagnant room, a smell so rich and foreign to the starving people that several children began to weep openly. She didn't just hand out pieces of fruit. She knew that wouldn't last. Instead, she created a dense, nutrient-rich pottage. She instructed the townsfolk to bring forward whatever scraps of food they had left, a handful of oats, a piece of tough, dried venison, a few withered root vegetables. She boiled the hard, leathery dried apricots, plums and apples in the water until they swelled and softened, releasing their sugars and vital nutrients into the broth. When the first bowls were handed out, the silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of desperate swallowing. The sweet, acidic tang of the fruit cut through the lethargy. For Clara's young son, Beatrice mashed the softened plums into a warm paste, gently feeding it to him with a wooden spoon. The concentrated vitamin C, preserved meticulously through Beatrice's obsessive dehydration process in the late summer heat, was an instant balm to the ravages of scurvy. Clara Higgins, the woman who had laughed the loudest at Beatrice's madness, fell to her knees beside the cauldron. She grasped the hem of Beatrice's faded wool skirt, tears streaking through the soot on her face. "I'm sorry," Clara sobbed, her voice breaking. "I am so sorry, Bea. We were so blind. We were so cruel." "Save your tears, Clara," Beatrice said softly, offering the woman a bowl of the warm, sweet broth. "Tears freeze in this weather. Just eat." The months of January and February were not merely cold. They were a prolonged, agonizing siege against the town of Pine Ridge. The snowstorms battered the valley with unrelenting, shrieking fury, piling impassable drifts up to the second-story windows of Clara's mercantile. While the biting frost still claimed its victims, the deeply ill and the very elderly quietly succumbed to the punishing temperatures in their sleep. The spectre of mass starvation, the great and terrible equalizer of the frontier, was held at bay. Inside the fortified walls of the town hall, Beatrice Gallagher became the undisputed matriarch and sole architect of the valley's survival. She moved her entire operation into the cavernous stone building, abandoning her mountain cabin to sleep on a narrow, uncomfortable canvas cot beside the main hearth. She guarded the remaining supply with the ferocity of a wildcat. Every morning, beneath the dim, grey light filtering through the frosted windows, she calculated the town's caloric needs with ruthless, mathematical precision. Using a small brass postal scale salvaged from the general store, she weighed out exact portions of the dried fruit, ignoring the pleading eyes of adults and the quiet whimpers of children. She knew that pity today meant death tomorrow. But as February bled into its final, brutal weeks, the psychological toll began to fracture the community's fragile peace. The towering stacks of burlap sacks were entirely gone. Only a few heavy clay crocks remained clustered near the fire. Every time Beatrice scraped the bottom of a crock with her wooden spoon, the hollow sound echoed through the hall, a terrifying reminder of their ticking clock. The tension in the recycled, stagnant air grew thick and volatile. Whispers of panic began to circulate among the huddled families. The ultimate twist of fate occurred on the bitterest, most unforgiving night of late February. The temperature had plunged so severely that the moisture in the air seemed to crystallize. Beatrice, who had trained herself to sleep with the restless vigilance of a sentry, awoke to an unnatural sound. It wasn't the wind groaning against the heavy timber roof, nor the settling of the deep snow outside. It was the sharp, distinct scrape of pottery on wood, followed by the muffled snap of a wax seal breaking. She slipped silently from her cot, her breath pluming in the dark, and wrapped her fingers around the heavy, wrought-iron fire poker resting by the hearth. Creeping forward in the dim, flickering light of the dying embers, she saw a figure crouched near the reserve supplies, prying open one of the last 3 remaining crocks. It was Mayor Silas Thornton. He had a canvas rucksack slung over one shoulder, his trembling hands frantically stuffing it with dried apples, apricots, and heavy plums. Beatrice struck a match against the stone fireplace and lit the nearby kerosene lantern, suddenly bathing him in a harsh, unforgiving yellow light. "Stealing from starving children, Silas?" Beatrice asked, her voice dangerously calm. It did not echo, it simply cut through the frigid air like a sharpened blade. Silas gasped, spinning around so fast he lost his footing. He dropped a handful of dried peach slices, the precious, sugary rings tumbling into the ash and dirt of the floorboards. He looked utterly pathetic. His once immaculate tailored suits now hung loosely from his diminished frame, his carefully curated arrogance entirely stripped away by the primal, selfish urge to survive. "I need it, Beatrice," he whimpered, his eyes darting frantically toward the shadows, searching for an escape that didn't exist. "I'm a man of importance to this county. I have a weak constitution. I can't survive on these meager communal rations. I have responsibilities to uphold when the thaw comes." Before Beatrice could raise the iron poker to strike him, the heavy oak doors of the hall's vestibule burst open. Thomas stood in the archway, a lantern raised high in one hand and his heavy service revolver drawn in the other. Behind the deputy sheriff stood a dozen gaunt, hollow-eyed townsmen, woken from their restless sleep by the sudden commotion. They stared at their mayor, taking in the sight of his leather boots surrounded by dropped food, his hands literally sticky with the concentrated sugar of stolen rations. The betrayal hanging in the air was absolute, suffocatingly heavy. "Lock him in the holding cell at the sheriff's station, Thomas," Beatrice commanded, not breaking eye contact with the trembling politician. "He can survive on boiled snow and his own self-importance until the train arrives." Silas was dragged away into the freezing night, weeping openly and pleading for leniency, forever stripped of his office, his authority, and his dignity. 2 agonizing weeks later, the punishing grip of winter finally began to loosen. The atmosphere shifted dramatically. The bitter, metallic scent of impending snow gave way to the heavy, earthy smell of wet pine, thawing mud, and emerging life. The thick ice capping the river cracked and splintered with resounding booms that echoed through the valley like cannon fire. The thaw had finally begun. On the crisp morning of March 18th, a sound tore through the valley that sent the entire town rushing out of their homes and the town hall, shielding their sensitive eyes against the brilliant, blinding glare of the spring sun on the melting snow. It was a long, shrieking, mechanical whistle. The Silvercrest Express had finally broken through Dead Man's Pass. The massive black locomotive steamed furiously into the depot, a battered steel snowplow affixed to its front. It hauled a long line of carriages, loaded down with hundreds of pounds of flour, coal, medical supplies, and federal marshals. When the emergency medical team rushed into the town square, they carried stretchers and body bags, fully expecting to find a silent graveyard, decimated by scurvy and severe malnutrition. Instead, they were stunned into silence. The townsfolk were incredibly thin, exhausted, and visibly traumatized, but they were standing. Their gums were healthy, their eyes were clear, and the children were alive. Dr. Aris Bennett, the chief medical officer on the train, eventually found Beatrice sitting quietly on an overturned crate at the far end of the depot platform. She had a battered tin cup of hot, fresh coffee in her stained hands. "In all my years of frontier medicine," Dr. Bennett marveled, examining the remaining, sticky dregs of the dried fruit inside one of the salvaged crocks, "I have never seen a stranded population survive a winter blockade of this magnitude without massive, devastating casualties from scurvy. The vitamin retention in this rudimentary dried fruit, it's nothing short of a medical miracle. You saved hundreds of lives, Mrs. Gallagher." Beatrice took a slow, savoring sip of her coffee. The bitter warmth a stark contrast to the sweet pottage she had consumed for months. She looked up past the bustling depot, her eyes settling on the melting snow receding from the mountain peaks. "I didn't engineer a miracle, Doctor," Beatrice replied, her voice rough but steady. "I just didn't want Arthur Pendleton to lose his farm to the bank. Survival is often just the byproduct of refusing to waste what you've been given." Later that afternoon, heavily armed federal marshals escorted a shackled, silent Silas Thornton onto the back carriage of the train, bound for the city to face severe federal charges of embezzlement, grand larceny, and public endangerment. He didn't dare look at Beatrice as he passed. The liberated town of Pine Ridge formally offered Beatrice the permanent position of mayor, a lifetime supply of goods from the newly restocked mercantile, and a grand parade in her honor. She politely but firmly declined them all, with a fresh, heavy supply of winter coal loaded onto a new sled, paid for in full by the humbled town council. Beatrice Gallagher turned her back on the valley. She hiked slowly back up the muddy, winding trail toward her drafty cabin on the ridge. She had a sprawling garden to tend. The soil was finally softening, and summer was coming. The town of Pine Ridge never forgot the winter of '98. The rusted tracks of the Silvercrest Express still wind through the valley, a silent reminder that steel and steam are fragile promises. True survival requires more than ledger books. It demands the foresight to see salvation in a rotting harvest. Beatrice Gallagher's legacy remains, a testament to the unyielding strength of a woman who outlasted the mountain's frozen wrath.